I know we don't have very much time left here, but I think it's an important topic that didn't get enough attention this week. And
Mm,
I think it's because a lot of people don't really understand like what the framing of this should be. But some crazy stuff happened in Sudan this week, which recently had a change in government due to an uprising a couple of
mhm.
years ago. And then this week there was this military coup that took place. You covered it on the Punch Out, and you follow Sudan very closely. So I was wondering if you could give our audience a very brief overview of what took place in Sudan this week, why it's significant, and why it happened.
Yeah, very significant, and I believe a protester was just killed, I think, a few hours ago by security forces. The death toll there is rising, and yeah, I mean, I think maybe the way for people to put it in context and what I've been telling folks is this is basically part 2 of 2019, the uprising that happened there that toppled the long-running government, more or less led by Omar al-Bashir, who's essentially seized power. It's a little more complicated than that in 1989, and then more or less ruled with some different coalition partners until then. And this was a huge mass uprising of the people of Sudan. It was very progressive in many different ways. You had people like the Communist Party, professional organizations, all sorts of different people from really all kinds of backgrounds coming out and saying that we have to make a change. The Bashir government, which I won't get too deep into it now, but let's just suffice it to say it wasn't taking care of people's basic social and economic needs in any way, shape, or form. And, I think also sort of hypocritically used as sort of an element of anti-imperialism to cover for that. Obviously, for many years they were big supporters of the Palestinian cause, and that, we'll get to that, plays a big role in this, and it plays a big role in what's happening right now. But I think that at the end of the day, we have to recognize that they were not doing what people needed, and I think that that is why they were forced out. And similar to what we saw in Tunisia, what we've seen in Egypt, what we've seen all around the world, quite frankly, of mass uprisings of people who are just sick and tired of being sick and tired. So what happens is this huge protest movement starts to rise up. And so some elements of the military that played a big role in the Bashir government decided to switch sides. And they were like, all right, well, we ain't gonna make it, so we better switch sides. And they were able to make some unity with some elements of the protest movement, but not all. The protest movement was under the umbrella of the Forces of Freedom and Change, so-called civilian coalition. So some of those elements, some elements of the military that turned sides in the government, they came together and they mounted a coup, essentially, and said, we're gonna be the new government, we're gonna have a more or less, let's just call it half civilian, half military government, and that government is going to try to bring stability in the country and pave the way for elections in 2023. Now, pretty much since that moment in 2019, this has all been very controversial. There's a lot of different pieces, but real quick. So you basically have 3 sides to this fight. You've got the Forces for Freedom and Change that are affiliated with the civilian side of this so-called temporary government. Then you have the military and their supporters, non-military supporters, who are also calling themselves the Forces for Freedom and Change. So there's a split there. So it's a little confusing, that are on the other side, blaming each other. The civilian side is saying the reason everything is not going the way you want, and things are definitely going very badly in Sudan. There's been a huge inflation that's going on. It's very difficult for people to eat, very difficult for people to get medicines. Maybe a good way for people to put this in context: there is a government program that's supposed to help with cost. It's $5 a month, and that is not enough money for basic medicines or basic food. So even with the addition of assistance from the government, many millions of people struggling to have food, medicine, shelter, all of that, and it's only getting worse because prices are continuing to rise. So you had the civilian side of the government saying, it's not our fault, we didn't do anything, it's really just the military, they're not following through, and they really just want to seize power. They're not interested in empowering the people and giving them the levers of a true democratic small d reality where they could determine the direction of their own country. Then you had the military forces and their supporters who were like, no, it's actually the civilian side of the government that's responsible for everything, and they need to reshuffle the cabinet. So that was sort of the 2 sides of it in the government. And then you have a third set of forces, which consist of the people who were central to the protest movement, but didn't agree with this new government being set up at all. That's the Sudanese Communist
Mm.
Party and various professional associations of, doctors, dentists, people like that who play a big role in the mobilizations, as well as something called resistance committees that represent different groups of people. And pretty much from Jump Street, they said this whole thing is a setup. Neither of these sides really are interested in what the underlying reality of the revolution is, which is to improve the social and economic conditions of people in the country and give them a role in their own society and empower them. And that ultimately they just want to rearrange the deck chairs of the previous system. And under the guise of democracy, they want to say, that they're under the guise of democracy, they want to maintain power and basically be just a new Bashir and his friends. So those forces have been very much central to the anti-coup protests that are happening right now,
Mm.
that are being brutally suppressed by the military government. They're shooting people, they're beating people, they're arresting activists. And it really all comes down, and this is why I said it's really part 2 of 2019, to is there just going to be a rearranging of the deck chairs among elites, or is there going to be a deeper, more thoroughgoing transition? A lot of people in the streets want a deeper, more thoroughgoing transition, but there are a lot of people in the high places that want to do whatever they can to prevent that. Some of those people who want to prevent that are on the side of the protests right now. Some of the people who
Mhm.
support the old regime are on the side of the protests right now. Some of the people who support the old regime are on the side of the military right now. So you've got a lot of different
Yeah.
elite forces that want an Egypt situation. They want to use the anger of the masses to put themselves into power. And then when the immediate post-revolutionary government doesn't work out, then they use the anger of the masses again to put themselves in power under the guise of righting the wrongs of those who derailed the revolution. And then you have those on the streets who are saying, all y'all are fraudulent, and we want to push this thing to its conclusion, give people power, control, and a different and much better reality in terms of what's going on. So that's the basic situation you have there. There are a lot of different pieces to this. Sudan was under many, many sanctions, principally because of its support for the Palestinian people. There were other issues it was allegedly about, Darfur and things like that. Wasn't really about that. And so in order to get out from under this, the government that came in 2019, they normalized relations with Israel in order to get access to
Mm.
international funds and under sanctions. And they've also been playing a very strong role in support of the TPLF in Ethiopia, and they've really been kind of the cat's paw of the US and Egypt in terms of putting pressure on Ethiopia around the situation there in northern Ethiopia. So the
Right.
government itself took quite a turn to the imperialist lane, if you will. And so that's also a part of this and also an element of this. There's much more that could be said. What is the role of the United States? I know many people are asking themselves that. That's not really clear to me. I think there are a number of people who are trying to make it about, the military is good or something and against the United States. That's not true. They're both for the United States. They both were complicit in moving against the Palestinian people. And in fact, the military government now, de facto government, allegedly told Jeffrey Feltman, the US envoy to the region, that they were going to do this. So I don't know if they were against the United States, I don't know why they would be meeting with them and saying, hey, by the way, help us out because we're going to take power. So anyway, long story
Right.
short, you have people in Sudan trying to push forward a movement for transformative change in their country and to try to push aside all the different forces that have been trying to derail that real powerful thrust that has come since 2019.
That was an incredible, like, Sudan in 5 minutes kind of moment. That was really thank you. I think a lot of people are a little bit confused about what's going on, and this is more just a comment, than a question because I don't think we have time to really delve into it too much now. But I think it's something to reflect on is when I look at I don't know Sudan that well. I won't purport to. No, but based on what you're saying and what I've read about the movement there in 2019 that has continued, and I look at places like Lebanon, which also actually had somewhat of an uprising in 2019, and I look at other places like Tunisia, like Egypt, like Syria, all these places that have these uprisings, they keep failing in many ways. And I think it's a good question. I don't think they're all the same, or, we should be suggesting they're all the same or like putting a blanket explanation. But all around the world, we continue to see like an uprising and anger against really archaic systems that just aren't working, but the uprisings aren't as transformational as they want to be. And I think it's a good question to ask why. Like, because you're not going to get it right until you figure out why. And I see a lot of similar like failures over and over again. And I don't think there's one answer to that. Um, but I do see over and over, especially like in on this side of the world, just a failure to have a cohesive, transformational, revolutionary idea that's organized. And I know it's hard to do that in countries where maybe that organizing hasn't been happening for various reasons. But it's certainly something to reflect on. It's because
Yeah.
it's frustrating. It's frustrating. These systems do need to change.
Yeah.
Um, and every time there is some hope that they might, it gets smashed in some way or another.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I mean, to stick with the Sudanese example, I mean, and not to keep name checking them, but I do think they're playing an important role and doing a great job. I mean, this is the point the Sudanese Communist Party was making, and that I think many people with similar politics have made. It's all about really the understanding of the state, and the reality is, in many of these countries, the governments are so dictatorial that any change in terms of access to elections, freedom of the press, the ability to protest, all these other things. I mean, these are huge changes in these countries. I mean, you think about Egypt under the former president there, and right now, quite frankly, under al-Sisi. You think about al-Bashir. You think about Ben Ali in Tunisia, and I think that it plays a role that can be very disorienting because you can have these
Mm.
huge, massive changes in your society for the better in many cases, and so it is revolutionary in many ways. And it has this feeling of like, wow, we've done so much. But it doesn't change the basic nature of the state. The elites, the rich who ultimately control it. And as we see in most of these countries, we're seeing it again right now in Tunisia with the attempts to roll back what's happening there, is as long as the state, as long as the government continues to be controlled by elites, as long as the rich and the powerful and the internationally connected are able to manipulate things behind the scenes to their desire, elections, freedom of the press, all of that can only go but so far. We see that in the United States. We see that in Europe, where there are elections, there's freedom of the press. I mentioned South Africa earlier, similar thing, vibrant protest culture in places like that. And yet and still, you still see the entrenched power of people setting clear limits on what's possible. And I think that's what is really missing in a lot of this, is a discourse that revolution is not just dramatic change. Even if it's dramatic change for the
Mhm.
better, it's a change in power relations. And those who are the humble people who are making up the protest movements in the street have to be able to take power in their own hands. And what power means isn't just
Yeah.
getting elected to office, it's the ability to exclude those who are going to try to manipulate things behind the scenes to make sure that their power is maintained. So I mean, it's a
And
longer question about that, but I think the role of the state is all important. The state is not neutral. It's an instrument of class
yeah.
power, and the class can mutate. They can be authoritarian, they can be democratic, they can be somewhere in between. Like the rich people, the elites, they can do all of that. So it's really not just clearly about the form, it's also about the content. And I think that's exactly what's happening in Sudan. And that's exactly what a lot of the people who've been criticizing both sides of the government, the ones that are overthrown and the military that's in power now, have been trying to make. Like, if we really want to make a change, we need to fully with the broom sweep out all these elites and bring the humble people who are making up this protest movement into some serious form of control.
And I think one of the best manipulators, when you talk about the manipulations behind the scenes, is, and I don't know if this is the case in Sudan, but I imagine it is because there is this sort of cookie cutter situation that you see happening in a lot of these developing countries, and I see it in Lebanon. And it was in Syria, and it was in Egypt, and it was in all of these countries. Is that when there is an upsurge in anger at a system, there is such a Western funded NGO kind of complex that is infiltrated civil society to try to affect the discourse and to try to push it in a direction that doesn't actually transform the power relations that you're talking about. So it's like this agenda that ends up taking over the media sphere and being the most projected voice. I saw it happen in Lebanon. That ends up just aligning itself in discourse with the US or with Western powers. And across the Middle East, we saw the Arab Spring take a nasty turn because of that kind of in the background manipulation of any grievances. And so it's really also a question of sovereignty, because it's like, how can you make transformational change when these massive outside powers always try to manipulate it to their advantage? And so it's incredibly frustrating. And this is one of the reasons why, I mean, I think it's so important to recognize why we as Americans, at least, should be, trying to we should be opposing imperialism because it actually makes it more difficult for people in other countries to have uprisings and to change their own systems because we end up so many times, our government ends up being the one that plays such a dramatic role and standing in the way and making it impossible for things to really change in a real way, and in many cases making it worse.
Yeah,
And
no,
that's the last thing I'll say about it.
no, I think that's good. I couldn't have said that better. I think maybe that's a good note to even end the show on.